The first of Jesus' I am statements can be found in John chapter 6, and it follows the feeding of the 5,000, one of probably the most familiar miracles that we hear, where Jesus takes a little boy's packed lunch of 2 fish and 5 loaves and feeds 5,000 people. And at the end of this, Jesus identifies himself as I am the bread of life. Now, in feeding the 5,000, Jesus is demonstrating his ability to feed people, his ability to be creator, to take things that are created and use those to provide for others. And when he identifies himself as the bread of life, I am the bread of life, he's pointing towards people's deepest need, a spiritual hunger for relationship with God, for food that will last forever. And when we think about I am the bread of life, there are 4 images that we can use to help us unpack this a little bit further. The first of the images that we can draw on is found in the passage, and it's this idea of manna. Now, manna was God's miraculous provision for the children of Israel in the wilderness. After they left Egypt and before they went to the promised land, they spent 40 years wandering in the desert. And every single day, God provided them with food from heaven. Bread came down from heaven to earth to meet their physical need. And here is Jesus identifying himself with manna. In other words, what he's saying is, I've come down from heaven to earth to fulfill your spiritual need and to satisfy a longing that only God can fill. The second image for us to draw on is again an Old Testament image from the time the children of Israel were wandering in the wilderness. And it's the bread of the presence. When the Jews were travelling through the wilderness on their way to the promised land, God gave them the tabernacle as a place to worship, and it was a symbolic place of where the presence of God existed. And one of the things that the Jews did as an act of worship was to offer to God some of their the produce, some of the first fruits. They surrendered to God a sacrifice of bread, and they would present 12 loaves and put them just outside the very heart of the tabernacle, just outside the very presence of God. And they were a sacrifice, but they were also something that was holy. Only the priests were allowed to eat the bread. For many of the Jews, the bread of the presence also was a symbolic representation of them looking forward to the Messiah who would come. So when Jesus identifies himself as I am the bread of life, he's also identifying this picture of being the Messiah, the Holy One, the one who can bring the presence of God. The third image again draws on an Old Testament children of Israel picture, but one that perhaps we're more familiar with in church today. Jesus draws on the sacrificial bread or Passover bread. When the Jews left Egypt, there was this incredible rescue of God called the Passover, where the night before they left Egypt, the angel of death passed over the houses of the Israelites who had identified themselves with God. And one of the things they did as a meal to celebrate that was to eat unleavened bread or Passover bread. And this sacrificial bread would be something that would be broken and shared. And Jesus takes this image of the Passover bread on the night of the Last Supper and identifies himself with that bread of being broken for us, sharing and sacrificing it for us. There's a sense of Jehovah Nissi, identifying with us again, and points us towards sharing in this, gives us eternal security, the assurance of our salvation, certainty of where we're going. This sort of gives us the fourth image as well, the idea of living bread. You see, bread is a staple for life. Give us today our daily bread, Jesus prayed. There is a sense that bread is the core for existence, the core representation of what we eat. And when we eat natural bread, it fills us for a while. Jesus comes to offer us something that will last for eternity. And when we share in the life and the death of Jesus, it's like we're sharing in that living bread for eternity, because the gift of God is eternal life. So Jesus identifies himself as the bread of life to help people understand more about his nature and his purpose. And he makes clear in verse 29 that this is received through faith. This living bread, this relationship with God is received through faith. You see, the Jews were looking for a Messiah who would bring manna from heaven, and their focus was in the wrong place. They were looking for the miracle, whereas Jesus was identifying himself as the source. And it raises the question for us about where is our focus? Do we chase the miracle, or do we chase the miracle provider? Are we more interested in the manna, or are we interested in the provider of the manna, the source of that?